The moment people started revisiting 50 Cent's documentary, one name immediately pulled everything into focus: Diddy. Not because of a single accusation, not because of a headline, but because the footage suddenly felt heavier than it did before. Conversations that once sounded like commentary now felt like warnings. And when Justin Bieber's name entered that same frame, the story stopped being about opinions and started becoming about patterns. What makes this situation unsettling isn't new information. It's new perspective. The same interviews, the same clips, the same public moments now viewed without the filter that once protected powerful figures. When context changes, meaning changes. And once that happens, it becomes impossible to watch the same material the same way again. Diddy has always been more than a celebrity. He represents influence in its purest form: control over access, careers, and visibility. In industries like music, power doesn't need to be loud to be effective. It works quietly, through favors, through proximity, through unspoken rules everyone understands but rarely questions. When someone holds that level of influence, their presence shapes environments whether they intend to or not. Justin Bieber entered that environment extremely young. His rise was framed as a dream talent discovered early, guided by experienced mentors, surrounded by industry giants who claimed to look out for him. From the outside, it appeared structured and safe. But structure without boundaries doesn't protect conditions. And when you rewatch those early moments now, what stands out isn't scandal, it's imbalance. A teenager placed in adult spaces, celebrated for fitting in, praised for maturity instead of shielded by it. None of that requires criminal intent to be concerning. It only requires a system that mistakes access for protection. In those systems, discomfort is often reframed as opportunity, and silence becomes the cost of success. This is where 50 Cent's presence becomes difficult to ignore. For a long time, his remarks were treated as jokes, rivalry, or entertainment. Easy to dismiss because of tone, delivery, or history. But when the industry itself begins facing scrutiny, those same remarks take on a different weight. Not as proof, as perspective. The industry has always been skilled at managing narratives. Awkward moments become jokes. Uncomfortable footage becomes viral content. Serious questions are softened until they disappear. And anyone who pushes too hard is labeled problematic. That system works until enough people start asking the same questions at once. Justin Bieber has never publicly accused anyone of specific crimes. That matters. But it doesn't erase the emotional toll he later described. Anxiety, instability, feeling overwhelmed, losing himself under pressure at a young age. Those admissions were often framed as the price of fame. But when that same price appears again and again across different artists, the issue stops being individual weakness and starts looking structural. What's disturbing is how normalized these environments became. Access to powerful figures was celebrated instead of examined. Teenagers navigating adult dynamics were applauded instead of protected. Responsibility was always assumed to belong to someone else. Management, labels, mentors, everyone watching, no one intervening. 50 Cent never positioned himself as part of that inner circle. And distance matters, because people inside closed systems rarely speak freely. Careers depend on relationships. Silence isn't enforced, it's incentivized. Speaking out doesn't just risk backlash. It risks isolation. This story doesn't require believing every implication to feel uneasy. It only requires recognizing repetition. Similar pressures, similar silences, similar outcomes. When patterns line up around the same centers of power, coincidence becomes harder to defend. That's why people are rewatching now. Not to assign guilt, but to understand how much was ignored when it mattered most. To question why certain dynamics were normalized. And to ask whether protection was ever truly the priority. Before we go further, ask yourself this: when you look at the old Justin Bieber footage today, does it still feel harmless? Or does it feel like something people avoided questioning because questioning it would have been inconvenient? Drop your thoughts in the comments. And if you're following this closely, subscribe, because this isn't just about one documentary. It's about how long a system can operate before people finally decide to look at it honestly. What follows isn't exposure. It's reevaluation. A closer look at how influence works, how silence is rewarded, and how power protects itself until pressure makes that impossible. Diddy's influence didn't exist alone, and Justin Bieber's experience didn't happen in isolation. This is only the opening layer of a much larger picture, one that doesn't rely on accusations, but on understanding how the same conditions keep producing the same outcomes. Once you start looking at the system instead of the individuals, the picture becomes harder to ignore. Because what keeps repeating isn't one person's behavior, it's the conditions that allow that behavior to exist without challenge. Power concentrates, access becomes selective, and silence slowly turns into the most valuable currency of all. In environments like this, protection doesn't fail all at once. It erodes gradually. Responsibility gets passed around so smoothly that no one feels directly accountable. Managers assume labels are watching. Labels assume guardians are present. Guardians assume the system knows what it's doing. And the person at the center, often young, inexperienced, and dependent, learns very quickly that questioning the environment feels riskier than adapting to it. That's what makes revisiting Justin Bieber's early exposure so unsettling. Not because of a single shocking moment, but because of how normalized everything felt. Being placed around powerful adults was treated as an honor. Being included in exclusive spaces was framed as mentorship. And any discomfort that might have existed was overshadowed by success, applause, and opportunity. This is how imbalance hides. Not through secrecy, but through celebration. When you're constantly told how lucky you are, it becomes difficult to admit something feels wrong. Gratitude replaces instinct. Silence feels responsible. And speaking up starts to look like betrayal. Especially when careers are built on proximity to people who control the gates. This is where the industry's culture plays its most effective role. It doesn't silence people by force. It teaches them the consequences of honesty long before they ever need to experience them. You watch what happens to those who step out of line. You see opportunities disappear. Relationships cool. Invitations stop coming. And the lesson is learned without a single threat ever being spoken. Within that framework, figures like Diddy don't need to actively enforce control for influence to exist. Influence becomes structural. People adjust their behavior automatically. They protect the system because the system feeds them. And anyone who disrupts that balance becomes a liability. That's why voices like 50 Cent's were easy to dismiss for so long. Not because they were necessarily wrong, but because they were inconvenient. His distance from the inner circle made his perspective uncomfortable. He wasn't dependent on the same approval. He didn't benefit from maintaining the illusion. And that alone made his commentary dangerous to the narrative. But danger doesn't always look like truth in the moment. Sometimes it looks like noise, especially when it's delivered without polish, without diplomacy, without concern for industry relationships. That's how systems protect themselves, by framing disruption as unserious. What changes everything is repetition. When similar discomfort appears across different artists, different eras, and different circumstances, denial becomes harder. When multiple people describe feeling overwhelmed, unprotected, or pushed too far too young, the explanation shifts. It stops being about personal weakness and starts pointing toward systemic design. Justin Bieber's later openness about mental health added a layer many people initially overlooked. Anxiety, emotional exhaustion, losing control at a young age. Those admissions weren't framed as accusations. They were framed as vulnerability. And vulnerability is often easier to sympathize with than interrogate. But vulnerability still tells a story, especially when it echoes experiences described by others who walked similar paths. This is where the narrative tightens. Because the issue isn't whether someone committed a specific act. The issue is whether the environment itself was safe. Whether protection was proactive or reactive. Whether boundaries were real or symbolic. And whether success was prioritized over well-being. The entertainment industry has always blurred those lines. Youth is marketed as authenticity. Access is marketed as mentorship. And silence is marketed as professionalism. When those values combine, they create a culture where imbalance feels normal instead of alarming. And once something feels normal, it stops being questioned. Rewatching old footage now, many viewers aren't seeing crimes. They're seeing dynamics. Who speaks? Who controls the space? Who adapts? Who appears comfortable? And who doesn't? These observations don't require speculation. They're visible. And visibility is powerful when people are finally willing to look. This is also why so many conversations stayed private for so long. Because public acknowledgement would have required confronting not just individuals, but the system itself. And systems don't reform easily. They resist. They deflect. They redirect attention toward personalities instead of structures. That deflection works until pressure builds from multiple angles. Legal scrutiny, public reassessment, cultural shifts. At that point, silence starts to look less like professionalism and more like complicity. And that's when old comments resurface not as jokes, but as signals people ignored. What's critical here is restraint. This story doesn't depend on proving every implication. It depends on understanding how repeated conditions lead to repeated harm, how imbalance doesn't need intent to cause damage, and how accountability often arrives too late to undo the impact. Justin Bieber's experience didn't unfold in isolation. It unfolded inside a machine designed to maximize output, visibility, and profit, not necessarily protection. That machine rewards those who adapt and sidelines those who resist. And young artists, no matter how famous, rarely have the leverage to change it. When people ask why no one spoke sooner, they often underestimate the cost of speaking. Careers are fragile. Reputations are currency. And isolation is a powerful deterrent. Silence isn't chosen because it's easy. It's chosen because it's survivable. This is the reality that gives weight to voices once dismissed. Not because they hold all the answers, but because they were never fully absorbed by the system. Distance allows clarity, and clarity threatens structures built on ambiguity. As more people rewatch, the focus subtly shifts. Away from shock, away from scandal, toward accountability. Not just for actions, but for environments. Not just for individuals, but for the culture that enabled them. And that shift is irreversible once it starts. Because the more closely you examine how power operates, the harder it becomes to accept surface explanations. The more patterns you see, the less convincing coincidence becomes. And the more silence you notice, the louder it feels. The kind that settles slowly and refuses to leave once it takes hold. It's the moment people stop asking, "Did something happen?" and start asking, "Why was this environment allowed to exist at all?" This is where the story fundamentally changes. Because once you accept that the issue may be structural, everything looks different. The footage isn't shocking anymore, it's revealing. The silence isn't neutral anymore, it's meaningful. And the people who once seemed untouchable no longer look powerful in the same way. They look exposed to a question they can't control. At this point, the focus shifts away from individual behavior and toward the architecture of influence. Who decides what's normal? Who defines success? And who benefits when boundaries remain unclear? This is the uncomfortable space where accountability stops being about blame and starts being about design. Diddy's role in the industry was never limited to one lane. His influence didn't come from one position, but from proximity to everything that mattered. Access flowed through him. Validation passed through him. Opportunity followed his approval. In that kind of ecosystem, power doesn't need to announce itself. It's understood. And when power is understood, people adapt to it instinctively. This is where silence transforms from a personal choice into a cultural expectation. You don't need to be told to stay quiet when you already know what speaking costs. You learn by watching. You learn by observing who remains visible and who fades away. Over time, the lesson becomes internalized. Survival depends on alignment. That alignment is what keeps systems stable long after they should be questioned. This is also why certain voices were never welcomed inside the conversation. Not because they lacked relevance, but because they disrupted the narrative. Someone like 50 Cent didn't threaten the system with evidence. He threatened it with detachment. with the refusal to depend on approval. And that alone made him difficult to manage. When you don't need access, you don't need permission. And when you don't need permission, you can say things others won't. For a long time, that distance made his commentary easy to dismiss. Tone was used as a shield. Intent was questioned. Motives were attacked. But once scrutiny begins to surround the system itself, those defenses weaken. Because the question is no longer whether one person is credible, it's whether the environment was healthy. And that's a much harder question to answer. Justin Bieber's experience becomes central here not because of accusation, but because of trajectory. A rapid rise, immense pressure, and a visible unraveling that couldn't be explained away by talent alone. When someone reaches global success and still struggles so publicly, the explanation demands more than surface-level answers. He spoke about losing control, about feeling overwhelmed, about not having the tools to cope. Those statements weren't framed as indictments. They were framed as reflections. But reflections matter, especially when they echo experiences described by others who grew up inside the same machinery. This is the point where people begin connecting dots they once kept separate. Not to assign guilt, but to recognize patterns of exposure, expectation, and silence. When the same dynamics appear again and again, the system starts to look less accidental and more engineered. Engineered not for harm but for output. And output doesn't require protection. It requires performance. That's the uncomfortable truth at the center of this story. The industry isn't designed to stop when someone struggles. It's designed to keep moving, to replace, to rebrand, to redirect attention. And as long as the machine keeps producing, the cost is considered acceptable. Until it isn't, because pressure accumulates, silence accumulates, and eventually so does scrutiny. Not in one explosive moment, but in a slow tightening that leaves fewer places to hide. When that happens, systems react the only way they know how, by protecting themselves. That protection looks like deflection, like reframing the conversation, like narrowing the focus to individuals instead of conditions. Because individuals can be isolated. Systems cannot. This is why accountability often stalls. Courts judge actions, not cultures. Contracts define obligations, not morality. And institutions are rarely designed to confront the harm created by their own incentives. That gap is where discomfort lives. And that discomfort is now unavoidable. People revisiting the footage aren't looking for scandal anymore. They're looking for context. Why certain situations were normalized. Why certain questions were never asked. And why so many people assumed someone else was responsible. This is where the story stops being about Diddy or Justin Bieber or 50 Cent as individuals. They become reference points. Markers in a much larger narrative about how power operates when it goes unchecked for too long. Power doesn't always corrupt through action. Sometimes it corrupts through permission, through what it allows, through what it ignores, and through what it rewards. The reason this realization feels destabilizing is because it challenges a comforting myth that harm only happens when someone crosses a clear line. In reality, harm often builds quietly inside systems that never pause to ask whether they should. That's the turning point, because once you see the system, you can't unsee it. You start noticing how youth is framed as resilience, how discomfort is reframed as growth, and how silence is reframed as professionalism. None of those reframes are accidental. They serve a purpose, and the purpose is continuity. What happens next isn't about exposure. It's about consequence. Not legal consequence alone, but cultural consequence. What changes when people stop accepting surface narratives? What shifts when silence is no longer rewarded? And what breaks when influence can no longer protect itself through ambiguity? This is where the stakes rise. Because once the conversation reaches this level, it can't be contained to personalities. It demands structural answers, and structures resist change more fiercely than individuals ever could. Once the system itself comes into focus, the story stops feeling explosive and starts feeling heavy. Because explosions are brief. Systems endure. And what endures leaves marks that don't disappear when headlines fade or conversations move on. At this stage, the question is no longer who did what. It becomes something far more unsettling. Who benefited from the silence, and who paid the price for it? Diddy's influence didn't operate through a single decision or a single moment. It operated through presence, through reputation, through the quiet understanding that proximity to him meant opportunity, and distance from him meant risk. In spaces like that, no instructions are needed. People self-regulate. They adapt their behavior without being told. And over time, the system runs itself. That's why accountability feels so elusive. Not because people don't want it, but because systems like this aren't built to absorb it. They're built to redirect it, to narrow conversations, to isolate incidents, to ensure that responsibility never climbs high enough to threaten the structure holding everything together. Justin Bieber's story sits uncomfortably inside that reality, not as proof of wrongdoing, but as evidence of cost. A visible example of what happens when someone grows up inside machinery that never slows down, never reassesses, and never pauses long enough to ask whether success is being achieved at too high a price. When he later spoke about anxiety, exhaustion, and feeling lost, many people treated those words as personal struggle, something to sympathize with and move past. But personal struggle doesn't exist in a vacuum. It reflects the conditions that shaped it. And when those conditions remain unchanged, the same outcomes repeat with different faces. That repetition is what finally pulls the curtain back. This is also where 50 Cent's role becomes clearer. Not as a hero, not as a prosecutor, but as a reminder of what happens when someone isn't fully absorbed by the system. Distance allows observation. Independence allows honesty. And honesty in environments built on alignment is disruptive by nature. For a long time, dismissing his commentary was convenient. It allowed people to avoid confronting larger questions. But once scrutiny widens, convenience loses its power, because the conversation stops being about tone and starts being about substance. What's left now is discomfort without an easy resolution. Courts may determine legality. Contracts may define liability. But neither can fully address cultural harm. Systems don't apologize. They adjust only when pressure becomes unavoidable. And pressure doesn't come from one voice. It comes from many people deciding at the same time to stop accepting surface explanations. This is why rewatching matters. Not because the past changes, but because understanding does. The same footage can tell entirely different stories depending on what viewers are willing to question. When power goes uninterrogated, everything looks normal. When power is examined, normal starts to look fragile. The hardest part of this story isn't what might be true. It's what was normalized. Teenagers navigating adult dynamics. Access treated as protection. Silence framed as professionalism. These weren't hidden practices. They were visible, just rarely challenged. And challenge is expensive. Careers depend on relationships. Reputations depend on alignment. Speaking out doesn't just risk backlash. It risks disappearance. That reality shapes behavior far more effectively than threats ever could. It teaches people to protect the system even when the system fails others. This is why meaningful change rarely begins inside the structure itself. It begins at the edges, with people who aren't dependent on approval, with audiences willing to question instead of consume, with viewers who notice patterns instead of dismissing discomfort. What makes this moment different isn't outrage. It's attention, sustained attention, the kind that doesn't move on after a clip ends, the kind that asks why similar stories keep emerging from the same environments. And that attention creates something systems fear more than accusation: accountability without spectacle. Not everyone involved will face consequences. Not every question will be answered. That's the reality of how power operates. But once the conversation reaches this level, it can't be fully undone. Because awareness doesn't require proof to persist. It only requires recognition. Diddy, Justin Bieber, and 50 Cent are not the story by themselves. They are reference points, signals that reveal how influence moves, how silence is rewarded, and how protection is often promised without being enforced. The real issue lives underneath all of that. in the structures that prioritize output over well-being, in cultures that celebrate access while ignoring imbalance, and in industries that only reconsider their values when pressure makes ignoring them impossible. The question going forward isn't whether people will forget. It's whether they will choose to keep looking. Because once you understand how systems protect themselves, you start seeing the same patterns everywhere. And once you see the pattern, the illusion of coincidence disappears. This story doesn't end with a verdict. It ends with responsibility not just for those in power, but for the environments that enable them and the audiences that once accepted silence as normal. If conversations like this continue, it won't be because of one documentary or one voice. It will be because people decided that discomfort was worth examining instead of avoiding. And that decision changes everything. If you made it this far, you already understand why this story matters. Share your thoughts in the comments. Do you think the industry is capable of real change? Or does it only react when pressure becomes unavoidable? And if you want more deep dive investigations like this, subscribe to the channel and stay with us because the stories that matter most are usually the ones hidden in plain sight.